Did you know that a police officer can make a fatal mistake in just a few seconds? Imagine this. A nervous officer, ready to act, shoots a German Shepherd, unaware that the dog has a very special owner. The boy's father is none other than an FBI agent. How do you think this story ends? Today, we're going to show you how this shocking incident was just the beginning of an even more unexpected series of events. Get ready to uncover details you didn't see coming, and how this turned the world of law enforcement upside down. But before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and comment below where you're watching from. I want to hear your thoughts on this unbelievable case. Now, let's dive into this fascinating story, full of tension and surprises. Hit play. The morning sun filtered through the trees lining the quiet suburban streets of Briarwood, a middle-class neighborhood in the heart of Illinois. Marcus Daniels, an enthusiastic and driven 18-year-old, walked confidently alongside Max, his recently acquired German Shepherd. The dog's sleek, muscular frame and intelligent gaze drew admiration from neighbors, who often stopped to comment on his beauty and Marcus's evident bond with the animal. Max had been a birthday gift from Marcus's father, Agent Jonathan Daniels, a seasoned and respected FBI agent known for his integrity and quiet resolve. The gift marked Marcus's transition into adulthood, a symbol of trust, responsibility, and celebration of the close relationship between father and son. As Marcus strolled, his thoughts were a pleasant mix of anticipation and pride. He was excited about starting college soon and looked forward to building a future with his trusted companion by his side. Max was more than a pet. He was a loyal friend, a source of comfort, and a reflection of Marcus's bright aspirations. However, the serene morning took a sharp turn when a police cruiser rolled to a stop just a few feet away from Marcus. The window rolled down, revealing the face of Officer Ray Thompson, a man infamous in the community for his brusque demeanor and sharp tongue. His presence often brought tension, and today would be no exception. Thompson stepped out, his boots crunching against the pavement as his eyes darted between Marcus and Max. His expression was one of skepticism, his tone dripping with condescension. "That's quite the dog you've got there," Thompson remarked, his eyes narrowing. "Where'd you steal him from?" Marcus froze, his heart pounding. His upbringing taught him to remain respectful in the face of authority, but the insinuation stung. He steadied his voice. "He's mine. Max was a gift from my dad." Thompson chuckled humorlessly. "A gift, huh? Funny how a kid like you can afford a dog like this. Got papers to prove it." Marcus fumbled in his backpack, pulling out a folder that contained Max's adoption papers and vaccination records. But Thompson barely glanced at them, his suspicion unwavering. The exchange began drawing the attention of passers-by, their concerned whispers adding to the tension. Max, sensing Marcus's distress, remained composed. His ears twitched, and his dark eyes stayed fixed on his owner, ready to react if needed. Marcus placed a calming hand on Max's back, whispering softly, "Stay, boy." But Thompson's attitude escalated. His hand hovered dangerously close to his firearm, his voice rising. "That mutt looks like trouble. You're lying about him being yours." Before Marcus could respond, the situation spiraled out of control. Thompson drew his weapon and, in an act of shocking impulsivity, fired at Max. The dog let out a pained yelp before collapsing to the ground, his body lifeless against the pavement. Marcus screamed, his knees buckling as he fell beside Max. Tears streamed down his face as he clutched his companion's lifeless body. The world around him blurred, replaced by the unbearable weight of grief and rage. Thompson, seemingly indifferent, holstered his weapon and muttered something about handling a threat before walking back to his cruiser. The crowd, now larger, erupted in outrage. Phones captured the horrifying scene, and voices shouted for justice. Unbeknownst to Thompson, his actions had set a powerful chain of events into motion. Marcus's father, Jonathan Daniels, would not allow this injustice to go unanswered. And the ripples of this moment would soon sweep across the nation, exposing deep fractures in the system and challenging Marcus to find strength in the face of overwhelming adversity. The aftermath of that morning unfolded like a storm, unrelenting and chaotic. The community of Briarwood, once peaceful and insulated from such horrors, was now in shock. News of the incident spread like wildfire, with cell phone footage of Officer Ray Thompson shooting Max circulating on every social media platform. By the time Marcus arrived at the hospital, still clutching Max's lifeless body, the damage had already been done. The world had seen what had happened, and there was no going back. Jonathan Daniels was already on his way back from Washington, where he had been attending a high-level meeting with the FBI. He knew something was wrong before he even picked up his phone. The dozens of missed calls from colleagues, friends, and even his own wife, Cassandra, spoke volumes. But it was the news reports that hit him hardest. FBI agent son confronted by police officer, dog shot in broad daylight. Jonathan's blood ran cold. He quickly read through the headlines, his mind racing. His thoughts immediately turned to Marcus, his son, who had been through enough in his young life. Jonathan had always been protective of Marcus, often taking him on trips and sharing moments of fatherly pride. But he had never expected anything like this. His training as an agent taught him to stay calm under pressure, but nothing had prepared him for the devastation of seeing his son's life thrown into turmoil. The plane ride back felt like an eternity. Jonathan's heart hammered in his chest as he envisioned what Marcus must be feeling. Grief, disbelief, and anger, all mixed together in a whirlwind of emotions. But more than anything, Jonathan knew he had to be there for him. He had to be strong for Marcus. When Jonathan arrived at the hospital, he found his son sitting alone in the waiting room, his face pale and his eyes empty. Marcus looked up, and their gazes met for the first time since the incident. His eyes were swollen from crying, but his expression was one of quiet determination. Marcus wasn't the type to show weakness, and even in the face of this unspeakable tragedy, he was standing tall. "Dad," Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. "Max is gone. They killed him." Jonathan's heart broke for his son. He pulled Marcus into a tight embrace, holding him as the weight of everything settled over them. In that moment, Jonathan made a vow. He would do whatever it took to make sure justice was served, not just for Max, but for Marcus too. The news of Max's death became a national headline. The story was everywhere, on TV, the radio, and across social media. People were outraged, not just by the killing of an innocent dog, but by the actions of Officer Ray Thompson. The fact that Thompson had a history of aggressive behavior only fueled the fire. The community began to question whether this was an isolated incident or part of a much deeper problem of abuse of power within law enforcement. Marcus, who had always been quiet and reserved, suddenly found himself thrust into the role of a symbol of injustice. Activists, reporters, and lawyers reached out to him, urging him to take action. But Marcus felt conflicted. His grief was still raw, and he didn't know how to navigate the wave of attention that was crashing over him. It was Jonathan who guided him through it all. He knew the system inside and out, and he wasn't about to let Thompson get away with murder. He filed a formal complaint with the police department, demanding an immediate investigation into the shooting. At the same time, he reached out to a high-powered civil rights lawyer, Lila Hughes, who was known for taking on cases of police misconduct. Lila was a force of nature, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for never backing down, no matter how powerful the opponent. "This is more than just a dog, Marcus," Lila said when she met him and Jonathan in her office. "This is about a system that lets people like Thompson get away with murder. We're going to hold him accountable." Lila's words gave Marcus a sense of purpose he hadn't had before. He wasn't just fighting for justice for Max. He was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by those who were supposed to protect and serve. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how deeply this incident resonated with him. His father had spent his entire career fighting for justice in the FBI, and now it was Marcus's turn to stand up and fight for what was right. But Thompson wasn't going to go down without a fight. As the investigation began to unfold, it became clear that the police department wasn't exactly eager to see one of their own face serious consequences. Thompson's defenders came forward, painting him as a hero who had acted in self-defense, saying that Max had been aggressive and that Thompson had felt threatened. Marcus felt a rising tide of anger as the lies and misinformation started to circulate. But the public had already seen the footage. The truth was undeniable. The outrage only grew, and soon protests began to erupt in Briarwood. People from all over the city joined together to demand justice. not just for Max, but for anyone who had ever been victimized by police brutality. The battle had only just begun. As the days passed, the pressure on both Marcus and his father intensified. The protests, initially a small group of passionate individuals, had grown into a full-scale movement. Chanting for justice, hundreds of demonstrators gathered outside the Briarwood Police Department, carrying signs that read "Justice for Max" and "End Police Brutality." The media coverage was relentless, with news stations broadcasting live from the scene, and the hashtag #JusticeForMax quickly became a rallying cry across the nation. Marcus, who had never sought attention, found himself at the center of a maelstrom. Reporters camped out at his doorstep, asking for interviews, wanting to know how he felt about the growing national spotlight. He couldn't escape it. Everywhere he went, people whispered, and the weight of their expectations pressed down on him. His classmates at Briarwood High, many of whom had never paid him much attention before, now looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Some reached out with words of support, while others kept their distance, unsure of what to make of the situation. Even his best friend, Jason, was struggling to understand how to handle the new dynamics. Marcus's life had been irrevocably changed, and Jason's hesitation only added to the growing isolation Marcus felt. "Are you doing okay?" Jason asked one afternoon as the two walked through the neighborhood. The streets, once familiar, now felt foreign. The atmosphere in Briarwood had shifted. Everyone knew who Marcus Daniels was now, and it made him feel like a stranger in his own home. "Yeah," Marcus replied, though the heaviness in his voice betrayed the facade he was trying to maintain. "Just trying to get through it." Jason paused, his eyes darting nervously toward the gathering protesters in the distance. "Do you think you're ready for all this? I mean, what happens if they don't do anything? If they just let him off the hook?" Marcus clenched his jaw. He had asked himself that question 100 times. The thought of Thompson walking away scot-free was unbearable. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but we have to try. We can't just let it go." The morning sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a faint orange glow across the quiet streets of Briarwood, when Jonathan Daniels received the first call. The voice on the other end was low and tense, but Jonathan instantly recognized it as that of his old colleague from the FBI, Marcus's mother Cassandra, who was at the hospital with their son. "Jonathan, you need to get here. It's bad, really bad. Marcus, he's in shock. You have to see it for yourself." His chest tightened, and a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach as he hung up the phone. Jonathan's world seemed to tilt for a moment, the familiar office setting around him turning to a blur of urgency and disbelief. He quickly packed up his things, trying to steady his hands. The fear he felt for Marcus was palpable. His son had always been the kind of young man who kept his emotions in check, the kind of person who faced challenges with determination. But this was something Jonathan had never prepared for. The news of Max's shooting had already started to trickle in through his professional networks, and while he had been hopeful at first, thinking it was a minor misunderstanding, he could now feel the weight of the situation. Jonathan knew that Briarwood was a small, tight-knit town, and the local police force had a powerful network of allies, especially Chief Harold Manson, who had been a friend of his late father. But that wasn't the issue at hand. Jonathan's mind raced, thinking of what had happened to Marcus, what had been done to his son. He couldn't allow the loss of Max to be swept under the rug. When he arrived at the hospital, Cassandra was pacing outside the emergency room doors, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She ran to him as soon as she saw him, taking his hands in hers, her voice trembling. "Jonathan, I don't know what to do. Marcus, he's broken. I don't even know if he can hear us." They entered the room together. Marcus sat at the edge of a sterile hospital bed, still wearing the same clothes he had on when the shooting occurred, a simple t-shirt and jeans. His eyes were empty, hollow as he stared out the window. The young man who had always been so full of life and promise was now a shadow of himself. Jonathan approached his son, crouching in front of him, placing his hands on Marcus's shoulders. His eyes were darkened by grief and rage. "Marcus, look at me, son," Jonathan said softly, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of urgency. Marcus's gaze slowly shifted to his father, but it took a moment for the boy to register who he was. Dad. His voice cracked. Max is gone. They killed him. He was just lying there, and I couldn't do anything. Jonathan's heart broke at the words. His protective instincts kicked in, but he knew the time for comforting had passed. The time for action had arrived. He needed to be the one to guide Marcus through this, not just as a father, but as someone who understood the insidious systems that sometimes shielded the very people who were supposed to protect the innocent. We're going to make sure this doesn't go unpunished, Jonathan said firmly, his voice almost a whisper, but with enough force that Marcus's eyes finally focused on him. Marcus shook his head slowly, as if trying to reject his own anger. What if it doesn't work, Dad? What if they get away with it? What if? I don't know how to fight this. Jonathan stood up and paced the room, struggling to contain his own fury. His mind immediately turned to the Briarwood Police Department, to Ray Thompson and the force that protected him. The truth is on our side. Marcus, Jonathan said, his words clipped, but you need to understand something. It's not just about Max anymore. It's about a system that will try to protect people like Officer Ray Thompson. You saw it, didn't you? How he handled things, how he treated you. Marcus nodded reluctantly. He was so sure of himself, so arrogant. He didn't care what I said. It didn't matter that I explained it was my dog. He just kept saying Max was dangerous. Jonathan's jaw clenched. He had a deep, instinctual understanding of how things worked in the police force. He had fought for justice his whole life, but the reality of his son's pain made him realize that this fight would be different. This wasn't some distant case, some cold file from the FBI. This was personal. A few hours later, Jonathan met with Lila Hughes, a civil rights attorney whom he had known for years. She was a fierce advocate for justice, especially in cases where systemic issues of racism and police brutality intersected. If there was anyone who could help them navigate the treacherous waters of this case, it was her. Lila's office was a small, cluttered space on the second floor of a building in downtown Briarwood. Papers were scattered across her desk, and the walls were adorned with photos of protests, marches, and victories in court. The atmosphere in the room was charged with a palpable energy, and Jonathan could tell she had been preparing for this moment for some time. I've seen the footage, Lila said without preamble as she motioned for Jonathan to sit. I've read the police report, and I've looked at Officer Thompson's record. This is just the beginning, Jonathan. We can't let them get away with this. Jonathan rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation settling over him. I know, but it's not just Thompson. This goes higher up. The whole department is complicit, from what I'm seeing. I've heard whispers about Chief Manson covering for Thompson. They've been covering for each other for years. Lila nodded gravely, her fingers tracing the edge of a legal pad in front of her. It's not going to be easy. Thompson's a public hero in some circles. The department has a vested interest in keeping him in power, and they'll fight back with everything they've got. We're going to need more than just the footage. We need to build a case from the ground up. We need to find people who've seen what Thompson and Manson have been doing behind closed doors. Jonathan sat back, his mind already working. He'd spent his entire career in law enforcement, but the level of corruption that he was now hearing about was deeper than anything he'd ever encountered. The stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about clearing his son's name or finding justice for Max. It was about dismantling an entire system that had allowed men like Thompson and Manson to thrive. This isn't just about Max. It's about every person who has been mistreated or wronged by that department, Jonathan said, his voice firm. We'll take this to the courts. We'll take it to the public. No one is safe if we let them get away with this. Lila smiled, a fierce, determined grin that mirrored Jonathan's own resolve. Then let's make sure they know we're coming for them. Later that evening, Jonathan and Lila went through the paperwork Jackson had provided. It was a treasure trove of damning evidence. The details of illegal activities, bribery, cover-ups, and racial profiling were all there. But what truly shocked them was the inclusion of an old, closed case. The shooting of an unarmed black teenager just 2 years prior. The case had been brushed aside with minimal investigation, and the details had been suppressed by the very same people who had protected Thompson. Here it is, Lila said, her voice low with disbelief. This case was quietly buried, but the evidence is all here. Thompson was involved in that shooting, and this was the start of his career as a rogue officer. It all adds up. Jonathan felt the ground shift beneath him. He had known Thompson was dangerous, but this was far worse than anything he had anticipated. The corruption ran deeper than a single officer. It was systemic, and now they had the chance to expose it all. "We take this to the press," Jonathan said, the weight of his decision settling over him like a heavy cloak. "We let the world see the truth." After the devastating confrontation with Officer Ray Thompson in the police shooting of Max, Marcus and his family were left to pick up the pieces. The physical and emotional scars were still raw, but the battle for justice was just beginning. Jonathan, though no stranger to the undercurrents of corruption within law enforcement, knew that this fight would be unlike anything he had ever encountered. The following morning, Jonathan sat in his study, combing through the case files, trying to make sense of what had happened. He had taken Marcus to the hospital, but the boy was still in shock, not yet ready to speak in full sentences, much less come to terms with Max's death. Cassandra had remained at his side, but the emotional toll on both of them was visible. The anger that churned inside Jonathan wasn't just for the loss of Max, but for the deep-rooted corruption he knew lay beneath the surface of Briarwood's police force. Jonathan's old friend, Lila Hughes, was the one person who could help them fight back, but even she understood the gravity of the situation. She had spent her entire career challenging systems of power, but this was a war against the very institution that was supposed to protect them. The Briarwood Police Department was well entrenched, and it was clear that their fight would be as much against the system as it was against the individuals involved. Lila's office, located on the second floor of a small downtown building, was a stark contrast to the sterile world of law enforcement. It was cluttered with files and papers, the walls adorned with protest posters and photos from past cases that had turned the tide on racial injustice. It was here, amidst the chaos of the world's broken systems, that they would begin to fight back. Lila's gaze was focused, determined as she passed over documents, tracking patterns of corruption that had stretched across Briarwood for years. "Thompson's past is darker than I thought," she said, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "The shooting of an unarmed teenager from 2 years ago? It's all in the records. A clear case of police brutality, but the files were buried. All the evidence points to cover-up after cover-up." Jonathan's fingers gripped the edge of the desk. He had known of Thompson's dangerous tendencies, but he had no idea the depths of his involvement in a much larger conspiracy. "This goes way beyond a simple abuse of power," Jonathan muttered, a grim realization dawning on him. "This is systemic. Thompson's been protected by the very people who should have held him accountable, Manson included." Lila nodded. Manson, the chief of police. He was at the center of the cover-up. Thompson's actions were well known to him, and yet, nothing was done. In fact, Manson probably encouraged the toxic culture. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He had known Manson for years. The man had always been a respected figure in Briarwood. He had come up in the department with Jonathan's father, and their shared history gave him access to networks that others couldn't break into. But now, Jonathan saw him for what he really was, a man complicit in the darkest corners of the system. They needed evidence, something irrefutable that would force the public to see the truth. The hours stretched into days as Lila worked tirelessly to uncover the full scope of the corruption. The investigation was growing, slowly but steadily. They had compiled testimonies from whistleblowers, current and former officers from Briarwood PD who had seen firsthand the way Thompson operated. Officers who were willing to speak out against their own, risking everything in the process. The bravery of these officers wasn't lost on Jonathan. It took incredible courage to defy the very institution they had sworn to protect. But it wasn't just about exposing Thompson anymore. It was about the entire system that allowed him to operate unchecked. Jonathan had hoped the evidence they had gathered would be enough to bring Thompson to justice. However, as the investigation grew, he realized the magnitude of the situation was even larger than he had feared. The corruption wasn't just limited to Briarwood. It was deeply tied to larger forces that extended throughout the region. This wasn't just a local issue. It was a battle for the integrity of law enforcement itself. They needed to go public with the findings. The time had come for the world to know the truth. As Lila finalized the press release, Jonathan took a moment to reflect. He stood in front of the window of his study, staring out into the morning light. Marcus had been asleep for hours, but the boy's mind was racing, still grappling with the emotional fallout of the night's events. The trauma of losing Max was still too raw, too fresh, to understand fully. Jonathan knew this wasn't just about the fight for justice. It was about helping his son process the grief, to make sure Marcus didn't lose himself in the fight. "Dad," Marcus said, interrupting his father's thoughts. Jonathan turned to see his son standing in the doorway. His face was pale, and his eyes were swollen from crying. But there was a fire in them now that Jonathan hadn't seen before. "I want to help. I want to be part of this." Marcus's voice was unsteady but determined. "Max didn't deserve what happened. I don't care if they say I'm just a kid. I need to do something." Jonathan looked at his son, a mixture of pride and sorrow in his heart. Marcus had always been strong, but this was different. The loss of Max had carved something out of him, but in its place, there was a resilience, a deep, undeniable need to ensure Max's death wasn't in vain. "You don't have to do this alone," Jonathan said softly. "We'll fight together. But it's not going to be easy. There are people, powerful people, who will do whatever it takes to stop us." Marcus nodded. "I don't care. They took Max. That's enough. I'll do whatever it takes to make them pay." Lila had arranged a meeting with the local news outlets for the following week. It would be a press conference, a chance to expose the evidence they had gathered, and to take the first step toward accountability. But as the days wore on, the Briarwood Police Department began to push back in subtle ways. Rumors began to circulate, anonymous leaks to the media, casting doubt on Marcus's account of what had happened. Whispers of aggressive dog and provoked officer started to spread, discrediting his story. The local police knew the game they were playing. They were trying to discredit Marcus, hoping that the public would start to question the validity of the claims. Jonathan's blood boiled at the news. He knew this was coming. He had seen it before, back when he had worked undercover in dangerous corners of the city. He had known how corrupt officers could manipulate the narrative to suit their needs, but seeing it now in his own hometown, targeting his son, felt like a betrayal. "Thompson and Manson won't go down without a fight," Jonathan said, his voice cold. "They'll do everything they can to discredit Marcus. They'll attack his character, try to undermine the truth." Lila, unflinching, responded, "Let them try. The truth is a powerful weapon." But Jonathan knew it wasn't going to be that simple. They weren't just fighting for justice for Max anymore. This was a fight for everything the Daniels family stood for. And it was a fight that would shake Briarwood to its core. With the newly discovered evidence in hand, Marcus and Jonathan knew the next steps would be crucial. They were now playing a dangerous game, one that could not only destroy the lives of the people involved, but could shake the very foundation of the Briarwood Police Department. Lila was ready to take the fight public, but Jonathan's experience made him cautious. "We can't just go in guns blazing," he said, pacing in his office later that night. "We need to make sure we have everything lined up first. If we go public with these documents without solid proof, it's going to backfire. Thompson's people will spin it, and they'll discredit us completely." Lila, who had been increasingly vocal about taking bold action, crossed her arms, her face hard with resolve. "I don't care about the fallout anymore. This is bigger than us. The department needs to be held accountable." Marcus, still struggling to process everything, sat on the edge of Jonathan's desk, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His mind raced with anger, frustration, and confusion. He had come to terms with his grief over Max's death, but the revelation about Thompson's past, the hidden history of corruption and brutality, filled him with an even deeper sense of betrayal. "I don't want this to be about revenge," Marcus finally spoke up, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I want justice. I want the truth to come out. But I don't want to destroy everything either." Jonathan turned to face his son. He could see the conflict in Marcus's eyes. The boy had always been thoughtful, never rash in his decisions. But this wasn't just any situation. This was a turning point, not only for Marcus but for the entire community. "I know, son. And that's why we're going to be careful. We're going to be strategic." Jonathan's tone softened. "But this time, we're not just fighting for Max. We're fighting for the truth. And that's worth everything." Chapter 8. The trap is set. The plan began to take shape. Lila began organizing a press conference, scheduled for the following week. She knew the media would be watching closely, and it would be the perfect opportunity to present the evidence they had gathered. Meanwhile, Jonathan worked behind the scenes, quietly reaching out to allies within the department, officers and civilians who had seen the corruption firsthand but were too afraid to speak out. He knew that he needed more whistleblowers to build a stronger case. Marcus, though still deeply affected by the loss of Max, began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. He started reading through the evidence, including the suppressed files and reports from Jackson. Each page revealed a web of corruption, betrayal, and lies that stretched much further than just one officer. The pain of losing Max suddenly felt like a symbol of the much deeper hurt in the system. But not everyone was on their side. Thompson, who had gone silent since the shooting, suddenly became more visible in public. He was seen at several press conferences, his smug smile plastered across his face as he defended his actions. "I did what was necessary to protect myself," Thompson would repeat in every interview. "I had to make a split-second decision, and in that moment, I believed my life was in danger. Max was an aggressive dog, and I had no choice." His words were full of arrogance, but they carried weight, especially since the public had yet to see any conclusive evidence to the contrary. The longer the police department dragged its feet, the more Thompson's supporters gained traction, casting doubt on Marcus's story. The department began to push back harder. Anonymous leaks were sent to news outlets, claiming that Marcus had been exaggerating the situation and that Max had, in fact, shown signs of aggression prior to the shooting. They called into question Marcus's ability to properly handle his dog, hinting that he had provoked the situation. The smear campaign against Marcus and his family was in full swing, and every day it felt like the walls were closing in. But Lila, relentless as ever, refused to back down. "They want us to be afraid," she told Marcus and Jonathan during one of their strategy meetings. "They want us to doubt ourselves, but we have the truth on our side. And when the truth comes out, it will destroy them." Chapter 9. The press conference. The day of the press conference arrived, and Marcus felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. His father and Lila had briefed him several times, preparing him for the inevitable onslaught of questions and media scrutiny. As he stood on the stage, the cameras flashing around him, Marcus felt a sense of overwhelming vulnerability. He was no longer just the son of a respected FBI agent. He was now the face of a nationwide movement. The audience was packed with reporters, activists, and supporters who had traveled from all over the country to witness the next chapter in the fight for justice. Jonathan stood beside him, his presence a pillar of strength, while Lila took the podium, ready to present the evidence they had uncovered. But just as the press conference began, an unexpected guest arrived. Chief Harold Manson walked into the room, his presence commanding attention. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as he approached the front of the room, accompanied by several of his officers, including Ray Thompson. Marcus's stomach turned as Thompson's eyes met his. Thompson's smug grin was gone, replaced with a look of cold disdain. The tension in the room was palpable. "I'm here to make it clear that the Briarwood Police Department is fully cooperating with the investigation," Manson announced, his voice thick with authority. "We will do everything in our power to ensure that justice is served, but we will not stand for the defamation of one of our own." Officer Thompson acted within his rights, and any suggestion otherwise is purely speculative. The crowd erupted into protests, but Lila, unfazed, stepped up to the microphone. "We're not speculating," she said firmly. "We have proof. We have documentation of Officer Thompson's history of abuse, misconduct, and the cover-ups that have protected him for years." The room went silent as Lila dropped the bombshell. The suppressed files, the history of Thompson's violent actions, and the records of his involvement in the death of the unarmed black teenager. She also revealed the testimonies of officers like Mark Jackson, who had come forward with first-hand knowledge of the corruption. The documents were passed to the press, and the truth could no longer be ignored. As the press began to buzz with shock, Chief Manson's face turned red. He tried to speak, but Lila held up a hand. "We've waited long enough. Now it's time for accountability." The first wave of justice had been served. Chapter 10. The consequences. The revelations sent shockwaves through the community. The Briarwood Police Department was forced to put Thompson on administrative leave as the investigation progressed. Chief Manson faced public scrutiny and was ultimately placed under investigation as well. The national outcry reached new heights, with people from all walks of life demanding police reform, accountability, and justice for victims of systemic abuse. Marcus, though still grieving the loss of Max, found a new sense of purpose. He had become the face of a movement for justice, one that went beyond his personal tragedy and spoke to the larger issues of racism, police violence, and the failure of systems meant to protect the innocent. But the journey was far from over. As the case continued, Marcus knew that the fight for justice was a long and difficult road, but he was ready for whatever came next. Max may have been gone, but his memory and the change he had ignited would live on.